The old house always gave me a thrill. Not the fun kind of excitement you get before your birthday, but the good kind of scared kind, like watching a horror movie with the sound turned down low. It stood on a hill in Penfield, New York, an 1800s mansion that had once been the biggest deal in town, and every time I went to visit my best friend Jeff for a sleepover, that twisted knot of thrill and absolute terror tightened in my stomach. Jeff's place wasn't just old, it was ancient to my 10-year-old eyes, a giant sprawling labyrinth of creaky floors and weird smells. Everyone in town knew it had been a stop on the Underground Railroad, but only Jeff and I knew the other stories, like the one about the Fiddler. Jeff told me about him one night, whispering it like a huge secret, even though we were already tucked into our sleeping bags in the basement.
He's the house's ghost,
Jeff insisted, shining his flashlight on the ceiling.
He starts playing this haunting, faint music around 3 in the morning.
I only half believed him, but it was a great story. What happens if you hear it? I asked, pulling my sleeping bag right up to my chin.
The rule is simple,
He said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low.
You have to pull your blanket or sleeping bag completely over your head. If you don't, the fiddler takes you.
We always slept in the basement, a huge concrete cavern that felt freezing and damp, but somehow safer than the dark, whispering rooms upstairs. We'd even explored the cold, mud-bottom tunnels down there once, the ones that supposedly led all the way across town to the old Strawberry Castle. We never dared to go all the way, though. You really think the fiddler's real? I asked Jeff one night, the question hanging in the dark between us. Jeff, who was already snuggled deep into his bag, shivered dramatically.
Dude, my grandma says she heard it once. Said it was the most beautiful yet terrifying music she'd ever heard. She had to bury her head under 3 pillows.
We talked for a while longer that night, about the history of the house and the enslaved people who'd hidden in the walls. Jeff even showed me the attic door, where hundreds of names were scrawled, faded with time, each one a silent record of a journey to freedom. The attic, however, was a place I absolutely hated. Jeff had shown me the murals up there, hundreds of painted children covering every wall, their eyes wide open, unblinking, turned toward whoever entered. It was the kind of detail that burrowed into your 10-year-old brain and stayed there, an image that kept me awake long after Jeff was snoring. Everything started to feel real one particular night. The wind was howling outside like an actual monster, and every creak and groan of the old house settling around me felt like a footstep. Earlier, we'd spent the evening exploring some of the house's countless secret passageways, our flashlights cutting through the thick, musty air of forgotten rooms. But there was one legendary hiding spot we'd never been able to get to. The secret door inside Jeff's older brother Dan's closet. Dan was a scary teenager, and his room was a forbidden zone. But tonight Dan was out.
This is it,
Jeff muttered, holding a butter knife up to the doorknob. It took an agonizingly long time to pick the lock to Dan's door, but finally the tumbler clicked. We crept inside, flashlights bouncing off walls plastered with posters of bands I hadn't heard of. His room was a treasure trove of analog cool, a shrine to music and forbidden tech. Dude, your brother's room is awesome, I whispered, staring at a giant component stereo with massive speakers, a CD player, and a dual cassette deck for making mixtapes. Stacks of CDs were piled everywhere, stuffed into a huge binder and a spinning organizer. Jeff just gave a casual,
Yeah, I know.
He shrugged, pretending it wasn't the coolest room we'd ever been in. My eyes found the computer desk. A clunky beige Gateway PC sat next to his closet door, with a screechy dial-up modem and a screensaver I knew all too well. Flying toasters. Jeff turned to me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light.
You ready?
I gave a hesitant shrug. Ready for what? We're already in here. Jeff ignored me and turned the knob to the iron door handle of Dan's closet. He pulled it open to reveal what looked like a normal closet full of flannel shirts and a pile of sneakers. What am I looking at, Jeff? I asked, genuinely confused. He slid back a few hanging shirts, gave me a dramatic wink, and then got down on his hands and knees.
It's here, man. Get down, come take a look.
I crawled up next to him, brushing aside a few pairs of dusty British knight's shoes. Hidden in the back of the dimly lit closet was a small, eerie wooden door. It was only about half the height of a normal doorway, making it look cramped and unsettling. A single bare light bulb hung above it. Dude, when was the last time your brother opened his closet? I muttered, staring at the layers of shirts and junk. Jeff didn't even look at me.
He doesn't, so you ready?
Ready, but for what? He didn't answer. He just reached out, turned the small latch on the little door, and pulled it open, revealing a pitch-black crawl space. Jeff didn't wait for my answer. He plunged headfirst into the opening.
Come on, it's awesome!
His muffled voice echoed back, already sounding further away than he should have been. I took a deep breath. The air coming from the hole was cold and smelled like dry rot and old earth, and followed him. It was a tight squeeze. The rough wooden beams scraped against my shirt, and my flashlight beam bounced wildly off dusty walls.
Watch out!
Jeff yelled. Suddenly, the floor dropped away beneath me. It wasn't a hole, but a steep decline, almost like a slide lined with smooth, worn planks. I shot down, scrambling with my hands and feet until I slid right into Jeff, who was crouched at the bottom. Dude, that was crazy, I laughed, the adrenaline making my voice shaky.
Told you!
Jeff whispered, the excitement now laced with seriousness. This thing goes on forever. We started crawling again, the passage undulating beneath us, a long, dark roller coaster. We'd climb a short, steep incline only to slide down another slick decline. It felt like we were tunneling deep into the guts of the mansion. You hear that? I asked, pausing. It was the house, but we were inside its sounds now, the faint howl of the wind, the low, distant groan of the foundation. Then Jeff's beam caught something, a small rectangular grate high on the wall, barely visible behind a loose support beam.
It's an air vent.
Jeff breathed. We squirmed closer. Through the narrow slats, we could see the familiar faded wallpaper of the main hallway. We were crawling in the space between the walls, moving right through the center of the old house. We're like ghosts, I muttered.
Or rats.
Jeff corrected. He pushed ahead, his voice taking on a worried tone.
Wait, this isn't right.
My flashlight caught what he was looking at. Scattered on the dirt floor of the crawl space were small, oddly shaped wooden chips, the size of fingernails. They were smooth and dark, and there were dozens of them. What is that? Jeff picked one up.
Looks like really old wood shavings, like someone was carving something in here.
He shook his head.
My brother has never been down here. I know he hasn't.
The air grew heavy and strangely warm. The tunnel took a sharp turn, and suddenly we weren't crawling anymore. We tumbled out of the darkness and landed with a soft thud onto a thick, woven rug. We scrambled to our feet, flashlights frantically searching the space. My breath caught in my throat. We hadn't fallen into another dusty passage. We were in a room.
Holy...
Jeff started, but trailed off, just staring. It was an incredible sight, a secluded, hushed space completely enclosed on three sides by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Hundreds of worn, leather-bound books were jammed onto the shelves, their spines faded in every shade of red, brown, and green. This wasn't just a reading nook. It was a scholar's secret sanctuary from the 1800s. The whole room glowed with dim, warm light, not from a modern lamp, but from a single beautiful oil-style lamp with a milky glass shade hanging from a dark, coffered wooden ceiling. In the center of the room sat a magnificent, deeply tufted brown leather armchair. It was huge, with wide arms and a high back worn soft and shiny from years of use. It looked like the most comfortable place in the world, and leaning casually against the front of the worn leather chair, just like someone had stood up moments ago, was a violin or a fiddle. Its wood was a rich reddish brown, and the bow rested right alongside it. I nudged Jeff. The fiddler, I whispered, my heart hammering. Jeff's eyes were wide, fixed on the instrument.
No way!
To the right of the chair was a small, dark wooden tripod side table. On it sat a glass with a little bit of amber liquid. Probably whiskey, I guessed, and a small stack of papers. The floor was covered by a thick, ornate rug in deep reds and blues. At the back, between two sections of shelving, heavy, deep red velvet curtains covered a window or a doorway, sealing the room off completely. The entire space felt warm, quiet, and utterly forbidden. Jeff cautiously stepped toward the chair, mesmerized by the fiddle. I moved toward the side table, my flashlight beam sweeping over the papers. Under the glass of amber liquid, I noticed a book wasn't just papers, but a small, heavy journal. Its cover was a dark, brittle leather, and a thin ribbon bookmark dangled from the pages. Jeff, look at this, I whispered, pulling the book free. He tore his eyes from the fiddle and came over. I carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, done in faded black ink. The date at the top of the first page we landed on read, October 18th, 1865.
October 4th, 1888. My hands are shaking so badly the ink is bleeding across the page. It's the chill of the harvest moon, I tell myself, but I know it's a lie. It's fear, a cold, deep-seated dread that has finally taken root in my bones after years of pruning. I have spent the better part of my 32 years with a fiddle tucked under my chin. Not a lucrative life, but a true one. From the smoky back rooms of river saloons to the brightly lit, if slightly dusty, dance halls of the city, my music has been my shield, my solace, and God help me, the very source of my family's bitter, corrosive hatred. They never forgave me for leaving the farm. Father, stiff-spined and pious to a fault, had the livestock ledger waiting for me the day I turned 16. He saw the future plain. Another generation breaking their backs on the same dry soil, worshipping the yield of corn as if it were the Holy Ghost itself. I saw a future I could barely breathe in. I was only 17 when I took Mother's old rosewood fiddle, the one she hid beneath the floorboards because Father called it a devil's box, and walked out in the dead of night. I played my way west, sleeping under canvas and earning my supper with waltzes and jigs. I changed my name from Elias Thorne to Silas Riverbrook, and for 10 years I was truly free. My music, they said, had a melancholy joy to it, the sound of a free man who remembers what it was to be trapped. But freedom is expensive, and loyalty is a debt that demands interest. 3 years ago, word reached me that the farm was failing. The land that Father had sworn was blessed had been cursed by a drought that lasted 2 seasons. They were on the verge of losing everything. My brother, Thomas, who always viewed my fiddle case as a coffin holding the family honor, wrote me a letter, not of love, but of cold, pragmatic necessity. "You have been wandering long enough, Silas," he wrote. "Your music has earned you enough to save us. It is time to pay your due. I sent them nearly all of my savings. Not because I owed them, but because I couldn't bear the thought of Mother's shame. It was enough to hold off the bank, but it bought me only temporary venomous peace. They have never stopped sending letters. Not asking for more money, no. Their demands are more insidious. They demand that I give up the music, that I return home and take Thomas's place in the fields, for his lung is weak from the coal dust of the mine he was forced to take work at. They claim my life is a vanity, a blasphemy, that the only true music is the hymn of the plow cutting the earth. This is where my dread takes shape. Yesterday, a letter arrived, penned not by Thomas or Father, but by my sister, Mary. Sweet, gentle Mary, the only one who ever tapped her foot beneath the supper table. The letter spoke of a celebration, a reconciliation. She wrote that Father's illness had softened him, that they finally understood my passion. "The bishop is coming to the church for a special harvest festival," she wrote. "Please, Silas, bring your fiddle and play for the whole town. Let them see that the prodigal son has returned, and that his gift is a blessing, not a curse, a harvest festival. A public performance, a blessing." It sounds like the reprieve I've been dreaming of. It sounds like the chance to finally truly mend the broken thread of my family. But Mary also added a chilling postscript, written in a cramped, hurried hand at the bottom of the page. "The old barn needs cleaning out before the dance. Be here by dawn on the 5th, Silas. Come straight to the barn first. We will greet you there." The old barn. It's the place Father always sent me when I was a boy, to beat the sin out of myself with hard labor. It smells of dust and dry straw and failure. Why would a day of reconciliation begin with work? Why would they meet me there rather than at the house? I have packed my fiddle. I have polished my boots. I am a fool, a desperate man clinging to the hope of a familial hearth. I know this is a trap. I know they hate my music more than they love their own souls. But I cannot resist the lure of Mary's gentle hand on the page. I will go to the barn. If I am wrong, I will play a triumphant air. If I am right, well, a musician must be prepared for his final solo. My lord, let this be the chill of the morning, and not the cold hand of betrayal. Silas Riverbrook, Elias Thorne, October 4th, 1888.
We stared at each other, a shared glance of terror and awe. Was the legend, the story of the fiddler whispered over countless sleepovers, actually real? The cracked, yellowed journal hadn't just confirmed a creepy bedtime tale. It had set in motion a new, deeply unsettling truth that thrummed beneath the skin of the quiet library. Every shadow suddenly felt heavier, every creak of the old house a potential footstep. The air in the small, dust-choked room seemed to thicken around us, pressing in. I slowly, reluctantly pulled my gaze from the brittle, fragile pages, still clutching the worn binding as if it were a lifeline. The ink, though faded, seemed to burn an image into my mind. "It's real," I whispered to Jeff, the sound barely audible over the sudden pounding rhythm in my ears. He didn't need convincing. His face was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on a point just past my shoulder, the corner where the shadows seemed deepest. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod. The silence that followed was agonizing, heavy with unspoken questions. What had we actually found? And more importantly, what was it connected to? "Maybe there's something else," I murmured, but it was the only direction forward. My hand trembled not from cold, but from a surge of nervous energy. Another journal, a continuation, a ledger maybe, something that explains the rest. That hope, that the rest of the story might somehow be a less terrifying explanation, drove us. We began our search, methodically sweeping the dark, towering shelves that lined the walls. Our fingers ran over rough cloth, slick vellum, and brittle paperbacks, the sheer volume of material and exercise in frustration. Finally, after a tense few minutes of searching, Jeff's hand froze. His fingers had brushed against a single, heavier volume tucked awkwardly between a history text and a collection of poetry. A worn leather ledger. It didn't belong. He tugged it free. It was thicker than the first journal, bound in heavy, distressed hide, and sealed with a brittle, broken clasp. The weight of it in his hands felt profound, almost accusatory. We exchanged another look, this one less about terror and more about grim determination. We had to know. He carefully lifted the front cover. Beneath a fine layer of dust, the ink was faded, but the handwriting was deliberate, assertive, and terrifyingly clear. Amos Thorne. We braced ourselves against the shelf, the old wood digging into our backs. The sound of our own breathing seemed deafening. There was no turning back now. We began to read.
October 5th. Elias's ashes, and I am finally clean. The sun rose today, pure and unblemished, just as the good book promised it would. The land, which has suffered under the burden of his sin, will finally be given rest. The deception was simple, necessary. I told Thomas and Mary that the Lord had sent me a vision, that Elias's life, his music, his wicked wanderings, his very vanity, was the curse that had withered our crops and soured our milk, that the money he sent was tainted, a meager tribute paid to the devil for the years he spent dancing. Thomas needed little convincing. He has the true harsh heart of a farmer. He understands the unforgiving necessity of the harvest. Mary, God forgive her, was the necessary bait. She still carries the foolish sentimentality of her mother, but her desperation to save the family's name was stronger than her love for her brother's melody. I made her write the invitation, the postscript about the barn. He arrived precisely at dawn, just as I knew the vain fool would. He was not dressed for labor, but in the silk waistcoat of a traveling showman, his cursed fiddle case clutched under his arm like a precious child. We were waiting in the old barn. Thomas had already secured the heavy plow chains to the central upright beam, the one his grandfather put in, and piled the dried straw ready. Elias walked in, his eyes darting toward the darkness, a flicker of suspicion finally sparking in his shallow heart. "Father," he began, that voice of his, smooth and deep, fit only for singing bawdy tunes. "Mary said the work began here? I brought my instrument." "You brought your sin," I interrupted, the words scratching out of me like rust. "The instrument of your pride. The tool you used to dishonor this house and profane the memory of your mother." His face went pale. The moment he realized the truth, the moment the music died in his eyes, was the only true look of his soul I had ever witnessed. He tried to run, the arrogance of the man, believing he could escape the righteous judgment of his own kin. Thomas was quicker. He is heavier, stronger from the hard, honest work his brother despised. Thomas tackled him, dropping him onto the straw and knocking the fiddle case against the stone floor. It made a muffled, satisfying thump. The chains went around his wrists and ankles quickly. He did not beg, he struggled. He spat curses and pleaded with Mary, who stood frozen in the doorway, her hands clamped over her mouth. She was weeping, yes, but she did not interfere. She did not open the door. She knew her duty. "This is not for hate, Elias," I told him, holding a lantern up so the light glinted on the metal. "This is a cleansing. This fire is a baptism to purify the land and redeem the Thorn name." I then performed the final necessary act. I walked over to the dropped fiddle case. It was battered but intact. I knelt down, opened the latches, and lifted out the rosewood instrument, so deeply polished it reflected my terrible face. I took the fiddle. Elias screamed then, not the scream of a man about to die, but the wail of an artist who has watched his life's work be taken. I dropped the fiddle onto the straw at his feet, struck a match, and let the small, hungry flame fall. The straw caught instantly. The blaze consumed the old dry wood of the barn floor, and the wood of the fiddle, the stench of varnish mixing with the smoke. The fire climbed the chains. He did not scream for long. The smoke was thick and swift. The last thing I heard was not a curse, but a sound of ragged, desperate coughing as the inferno took him. We stood there, the three of us, until the barn was fully engulfed and the roof began to collapse with a roar. We stood until the heat was too great to bear, watching the Lord consume the vanity and the blasphemy. The scent of the fire is still clinging to my coat, but the farm is saved. The debt is paid in full. Elias is gone. And I pray that the Lord accepts the offering of a father who did what was necessary to save his flock from the devil's music. The Thorn name will thrive again, rooted not in wicked song, but in honest soil. Tomorrow we will begin clearing the ashes, Amos Thorne, October 5th.
Jeff and I backed away from the table, our eyes darting between the open journal and the now terrifying fiddle resting on the chair. The entire secret room, the perfect, cozy sanctuary, now felt like a trap, and the silence was deafening. My hand dropped the leather-bound ledger as if the brittle pages were coated in ash and sin. It fell with a soft, thudding weight onto the thick rug, the sound absorbed instantly by the room's heavy stillness. We hadn't just found a ghost story, we had found the murder.
He burned him.
Jeff whispered, the words shaking so badly they barely made it out.
His own father. They burned him in the barn.
I couldn't look at him, couldn't move my eyes from the fiddle. It was propped so casually against the armchair, its reddish-brown wood glowing softly in the oil lamp's light. This wasn't just an instrument, it was the instrument. The one Silas Elias had been so desperate to save, the last thing his father had taken from him before setting the fire. But the ledger said it was burned. It's not the same one, I mumbled, grasping for a splinter of logic. It can't be. Amos said he burned the fiddle, too. Jeff finally tore his gaze from the terrible words and looked at the instrument. His eyes narrowed.
Maybe he bought another one to keep in here, to remind him he won.
The thought was grotesque. A trophy. A constant silent monument to the murder of his own son, hidden away in a secret library. I took a shaky step toward the armchair, my flashlight beam trembling. My heart was pounding, the sound echoing hollowly in my ears. I reached out a finger, not daring to touch the violin itself, but just the dark, oiled wood of the chair. It was still slightly warm.
Wait!
Jeff said, his voice sharp with new fear. He wasn't looking at the chair. He was looking at the ceiling. I followed his gaze. The heavy dark wood ceiling was coffered, divided into sunken square or rectangular panels. In the exact center of one of the panels, directly over the fiddle and the chair, there was a small, perfectly round hole. It was no bigger than a quarter, just a dark, smooth aperture in the ancient wood. "What is that?" I whispered. Jeff moved to the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the ceiling.
It looks like a peephole or a little vent.
He shined his flashlight beam up at it. The light disappeared into the darkness above, reflecting nothing back.
It's coming from up there.
Jeff breathed, his voice barely audible. "What is?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached a hand out toward the fiddle. I felt a surge of pure, panicked adrenaline. "Don't, Jeff, don't touch it." He ignored me, his fingers closing around the neck of the instrument. He lifted it slowly, and as he did, the warm glow of the oil lamp seemed to flicker for a second, casting a sudden, enormous shadow that swallowed the room. And that's when we heard it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was a single, long, drawn-out creak from the ceiling above the dark hole. Then, a sound so faint, so delicate, it felt more like a memory than a physical noise, began to drift down into the room. It was the music. A single violin string was plucked. It was a clear, high, silvery note that hung in the air, vibrating. It was undeniably beautiful, but under the circumstances, it was the most horrifying sound I had ever heard. The fiddler. The note was immediately followed by another, lower one, then a graceful, agonizingly slow run of 3 more notes that formed a broken, haunting melody. It wasn't the frenzied music of a ghost, but a sound of profound, weary melancholy. It was the sound of a free man who remembers what it was to be trapped. Jeff's face was chalk white. He still held the fiddle, but his hand was frozen, his mouth open in a silent gasp. I then remembered the rule, the simple rule we were unable to follow. You have to pull your blanket or sleeping bag completely over your head. If you don't, the fiddler takes you. We had no blankets. We had only the terror of the music and the horrifying knowledge of how Silas Riverbrook had died. Then, another sound joined the music. A thin, dry, scraping noise like a fingernail dragging across old parchment. It was coming from the dark hole in the ceiling. The scraping was getting louder, faster, and the music was intensifying, weaving itself into a desperate, tragic waltz. We locked eyes. The fear was a living thing between us.
The crawl space now!
Jeff finally rasped, his eyes wide with a manic energy.
We have to get back in the crawl space now!
He dropped the fiddle back into the chair. It landed with a soft, muffled sound against the leather, and as it did, the oil lamp flickered again, going almost completely dark before surging back to life. We didn't hesitate. We scrambled over the discarded journals in the side table, clawing at the section of bookshelf where we had tumbled out. We plunged through the opening, back into the tight, suffocating darkness of the crawl space. The faint, haunting melody of the fiddle now muffled, but still terrifyingly present behind us. We didn't bother with our flashlights. We were scrambling, blindly crawling and pushing, driven by the memory of the scraping sound above, and the knowledge that something had just been looking down at us. We had to get back to Dan's room and leave it before he got back. We had to get back to the basement. We had to hide. The moment we entered the passageway, the music vanished. The immediate, absolute silence of the crawl space was almost as terrifying as the fiddle's tune. It felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the hidden room, leaving only the smell of dry rot and old earth. We scrambled forward, no longer navigating, but desperately pushing through the narrow tunnel. The memory of the journal entries, Elias's ashes, and I am finally clean, and the dark hole in the ceiling were propelling us. Go, go, I hissed, digging my fingers into the rough wooden floorboards, the urgency erasing all the earlier thrill. We reached the steep slide we'd enjoyed so much on the way in, and this time, it was a blur of panic. We shot up the incline and slammed into the opening of Dan's closet. Jeff, being ahead, didn't hesitate. He kicked his legs and shoved his body through the half-height doorway. I followed, scraping my chin on the bottom beam, tumbling out onto the pile of sneakers and flannel shirts. We were back in the forbidden room, but we weren't safe. The memory of the scraping sound was still right behind my ears. Jeff was already at the closet door. He fumbled with the small brass latch, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the butter knife we'd used to pick the lock. He snatched it up, forcing the latch closed with a heavy click. We both backed away from the closet, staring at the closed door, expecting the wood to splinter open at any second. The lock, I breathed, pointing at the doorknob of Dan's room. We have to lock the main door. Jeff nodded frantically. He practically flew across the room to the main doorknob. Then we noticed the doorknob. It was already turning. Click. The door to Dan's room began to creak open. We froze. Dan's shadow, tall, imposing, and familiar, fell across the floor, slicing the room in half. He stood there, silhouetted in the hallway light, his eyes narrow, instantly taking in the ransacked closet, the butter knife on the floor, and the two terrified 10-year-olds pressed against his beige Gateway PC.
What in the actual hell are you two doing in my room?
Dan's voice was low, deliberate. He sounded cold, not angry, which was worse.
And what did you do to my closet?
He took a slow step toward us, and his shadow grew. In that instant, two things happened simultaneously. The thick bass speakers on Dan's giant stereo system suddenly, violently started buzzing, a low, distorted, vibrating hum that made the floor tremble under our feet. And from the now-closed closet door, a noise started up. It wasn't the slow, elegant music of the fiddle we just heard. This was different. This was a frantic, chaotic, sawing sound, like a violin being played by a man whose soul was on fire, a fast, ugly, horrifying reel, scraping and screeching through the wood. Dan, focused entirely on us, stopped dead. His face, which moments before had been hard with teenage fury, crumpled into a look of absolute, pure terror. He didn't need a journal entry or a secret tunnel. He recognized the sound. Dan didn't look at us. He didn't look at the closet. He looked up at the ceiling, then spun and launched himself through the open doorway. He shrieked, his voice cracking, louder and more terrified than we had ever heard it. He grabbed us both by the arms, dragging us out of the room. He didn't stop to close the door. We barreled down the dark, wooden hallway and didn't slow down until we reached the top of the basement stairs. Dan shoved us down first.
Get in your sleeping bags.
He screamed, his voice strained and desperate, before he kicked the basement door shut and threw his entire body against it, slamming the latch home. The screeching, frantic music of the fiddler echoed from the room above us, a sound of absolute chaotic rage. We were tumbling down the stairs, but the sound of the ghost was everywhere now. It wasn't faint, it was right here.